Welcome to this year's annual Ukrainian Famine Lecture. My name is Marta Bazuk, and I'm the Executive Director of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, or HREC as many of you know us. Tonight marks the 28th Toronto Annual Ukrainian Famine Lecture, and I would like to thank our co-sponsors for continuing the tradition with us. The Petro Yatsik Program for the Study of Ukraine at the Center for European and Eurasian Studies, the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, Toronto branch, and St. Volodymyr Institute. I would also like to thank the Temerty Foundation. It was the generous funding of the Temerty Foundation that allowed us in 2014 to establish HREC at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. And the Temerty Foundation has continued to support Holodomor Studies with incredible generosity. We are also fortunate and grateful to have the support of the Beshutsky family. Their support has made it possible for HREC to expand the scope of its activities, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Consul General from Ukraine, Oleg Nikolenko, for honoring us with his presence tonight, and he's with his wife as well. And we had a moment to speak before we started, and he himself is the descendant of Holodomor survivors from the Kherson region. As November is the month when the victims of the Holodomor are commemorated, there are some initiatives I'd like to bring to your attention. When you came in, you may have noticed the posters in the lobby area. There is a Holodomor commemorative exhibit at St. Volodymyr Institute through November 24th. It's an immersive exhibit that explores various aspects of the Holodomor through a series of life-sized photo panels that feature QR codes linking to survivor testimony. And on that poster, there's a QR code that you can, if you would like more information about the exhibit. The second initiative I'd like to point out is the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. It will hold a town hall meeting devoted to the Holodomor on November 13th at the Delta Hotel at the airport. It's part of the UCC Triennial Congress, and it's being held with the aim of sharing accomplishments and planning for the future. And the third initiative I'd like to mention is our own, a state-of-the-art online course about the Holodomor. HREC has worked for more than 2 years with dozens of experts internationally and the production company Sandbox to produce this course. The massive open online course will be accessible to everyone, everywhere, at no cost. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Temerty Foundation and to Paul Beshutsky and his family for their foresight in supporting this groundbreaking effort, drawing on the breadth of research available to create an engaging, informative, educational resource. And with that, I'd like to show the short trailer. I think I have to give a cue. Yes, there.
For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union denied that millions of people died of starvation in the 1930s and that Soviet authorities were responsible. The Holodomor was little studied by academics, despite the enormity of the event. In this course, we'll explore the history and events surrounding the Holodomor, consider its causes, place it into historical and political context, and examine the long-term effects and memorialization of this tragic event. Some 3.5 million people in Ukraine were starved to death in the first half of 1933 alone. By highlighting the lived experiences of both victims and survivors of the Holodomor, we'll come to a greater understanding of how and why this tragic event was allowed to happen and why it remained in the dark for so many years.
The 13-module course is completed and is currently being uploaded to the Coursera platform, and that'll take another week or so. I urge you to keep an eye on our website, holodomor.ca, and to sign up for our newsletter for updates. You can sign up on one of the sign-up sheets outside this hall. A number of dynamic young scholars in Holodomor studies contributed to the course. One of them is with us tonight. More than one of them. Henry Prown, our lecturer, wrote one of the scripts for one of the modules, and also Karolina Kuzyura, who will introduce our lecturer tonight. Dr. Kozyura is currently a Petro-Jacek Post-Doctoral Fellow here at the Monk School. She is a cultural and historical sociologist who studies legacies of violence, identity formation processes, and knowledge production, and she has written extensively on the Holodomor. But before I turn the floor over to her, I'd just like to invite you all to stay and join us after the lecture and Q&A for a reception in the adjoining room. Carolina?
Good evening. My name is Karolina Kozyura, and I'm a Petro-Jacek Post-Doctoral Fellow in Ukrainian Studies at the Center for East European and Euro-Asian Studies at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Henry Prown. But before we begin the formal proceedings, I do want to acknowledge the land on which we are seated. The University of Toronto operates on land that has for thousands of years been traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I've had the privilege of knowing Henry's work for quite some time. Thanks to the support of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, and in particular its executive director, Marta Baziuk, as well as Professor Frank Sisson, Professor Olga Andrzejewski, and many other scholars I see in this room, and they probably join us online, we had the chance to meet at different workshops, conferences, and academic conventions discussing the Holodomor, its enduring significance, and global context. I think that Henry would probably agree with me that we are the cases of the most recent and very interdisciplinary expansion of the field. Today, we will explore the Holodomor from the perspective of media studies, American studies, and Cold War studies in particular. And this is a very timely connection and very timely exploration. In one of her last interviews, Hannah Arendt, the most important philosopher of the 20th century, said, and I quote, "What makes it possible for a totalitarian or any other dictatorship to rule is that people are not informed. How can you have an opinion if you are not informed? If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer." In her work, Hannah Arendt dedicated significant space to thinking about problems of truth and politics, and in particular to the danger posed by mass propaganda and the manipulation of facts in the pursuit of freedom and democracy. The darkness of the 20th century, Arendt highlighted in her book, Men in Dark Times, published in 1968, comes not from the invisibility and secrecy surrounding horrors and violence, but ways in which they remain hidden in very public discourse. The international media manipulation surrounding the developing famine in Ukraine in the 1930s is perhaps one of the most significant 20th century examples of how propaganda can not only distort facts and influence political responses to violence, but also produce lasting effects on understanding the dark times for decades to come. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry Prown as he provides a very timely analysis of the manipulation surrounding the famine in Great Depression era media. Dr. Prown is currently a research fellow at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. He received his PhD in American Studies from William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And his dissertation, which explores the historical relationship between Stalinism and the American media during the Great Depression, won the 2022 award given by the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory in Tallinn. From 2022 to 2025, he was a Temerty Post-Doctoral Fellow in Holodomor Studies at the University of Alberta, where he also taught courses on, among other subjects, American history, the global history of communism, and the Holodomor. He has served as a contributing author and editor to the upcoming open course on the Holodomor, as was mentioned. And I think we will learn a lot about his contribution tonight. He has published extensively on American communist media, propaganda, and the Holodomor denial, particularly in the context of the Depression-era American press. His book, and this is the promotional part, Communist Propaganda in the Pre-Cold War America, The Daily Worker and the Great Depression, will be published very soon by Bloomsbury Academic as part of the Harvard Cold War Studies book series. The book offers important insights into the forgotten words of American Bolshevism, as it demonstrates that press-oriented agitation and propaganda efforts played a key role in the political strategy of the Communist Party of the United States, as it rose to its unprecedented cultural prominence and political influence. I think we should see the book by the end of November. We are all going to be able to read it, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about it in the next hour or so. The topic of Henry's lecture this evening is How to Hide the Famine, the Holodomor as History and Heuristic. Henry, welcome to the Monk School, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to begin tonight by echoing Marta and thanking the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium and Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, the Petro-Jack Program for the Study of Ukraine at the University of Toronto, the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress here in Toronto, and the St. Volodymyr Institute for the kind invitation to speak to you all this evening, the organizers for their work in making this happen, Dr. Karolina Koziora for her kind introduction, and the Temerty Foundation and Bazyuki family for supporting my own research that I'm going to share with you tonight. Pictured here is the Grand Toshogu Shrine. According to Atlas Ascurica, the shrine was built in the small city of Nikko in central Japan and dedicated to Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate who was deified posthumously. Historically one of Japan's leading shrines, it is now registered as a World Heritage Site and is known for its striking beauty. One of the buildings that form the complex is the Sacred Stable, which is adorned with an 8-panel sculpture attributed to Hidari Jinguru, a legendary sculptor whose existence is still a matter of debate. The sculpture depicts 8 stages of life enacted by monkeys. Its most notable panel is called 3 Wise Monkeys, which depicts 3 Japanese macaques representing the principle of not seeing, or mizaru, not hearing, or kikazaru, and not saying, iwazaru. This particular relief was introduced to the Western world during the Meiji era, towards the end of the 19th century, leading to the coinage of that proverb, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And this is, you might say, the theme of my talk today, which deals precisely with the question of how we remember famines, how we forget them, and how we actively hide them as they're happening. Indeed, it is the story of how we develop vast and varied ecosystems of denial to engineer and enable acts of mass atrocity and genocide. Around this time last fall, a curious article appeared in the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda with the following headline: A monument to the victims of the Holodomor was discovered in the Kherson village of Novomayachka. The authors noted with evident concern that the monument still stands, and this is despite the fact that the region became part of Russia 2 years ago. Following a campaign of destruction the prior November, over a dozen such memorials had been demolished throughout the oblast, and evidently the journalist had assumed that none remained. The timing of this November destruction campaign was likely not coincidental, given that Ukrainian people across the world, from the mud-filled trenches of the Donbass to the hollowed halls of Canada's corridors of power, set aside the 23rd of November to remember a tragedy and a crime that many would rather be forgotten: the forced mass starvation of millions of Ukrainians in the early 1930s by the Stalinist regime that is now widely known as the Holodomor. Or alternatively, the so-called Holodomor, as the Russian government terms it. To return to the Pravda article on the final remaining Holodomor monument in southern Ukraine, it suggested, quote, that the topic of the quote-unquote Holodomor is part of anti-Russian propaganda, while in reality, many regions of the USSR were starving in those years. A fair point, you might assume, though one is then forced to wonder why Russian occupying authorities are not just destroying Holodomor memorials, but also monuments to victims of Stalinist repression more generally, for instance in Luhansk last summer, or why these are being replaced by busts of the mustachioed dictator himself in occupied cities like Melitopol. Moreover, one must ask why this 1930s-era starvation seemed to hit certain regions of that vast Soviet empire with particular severity. Why, according to recent demographic studies, upwards of 9 times as many Ukrainians perished as Russians. Why the overwhelmingly Russian oblasts on the northern borders of Ukraine experienced very little starvation, and why the oblasts to the east with large Ukrainian populations experienced a great deal. We must ask what precisely Joseph Stalin had meant in the summer of 1932 when he told his top Russian officials, in the face of reports of famine from his top Ukrainian officials, to give the most serious attention to Ukraine, isolate the whining, and ensure genuinely Bolshevik decisions. What those decisions were, a ratcheting up of the forced requisition campaign, the ration blacklisting of entire districts, and a military-style blockade of Ukraine as a whole, are now a matter of historical record. Soviet dissident Lev Kopelev, one of the so-called 25,000ers sent into these farming communities to deprive already starving Ukrainian peasants of their last morsels that winter of 1932 to 1933, recalled the following. I took part in this myself, scouring the countryside, searching for hidden grain, testing the earth with an iron rod for loose spots that might lead to buried grain. With the others, I emptied out the old folks' storage chests, stopping my ears to the children's crying and the women's wails. For I was convinced that I was accomplishing the great and necessary transformation of the countryside. Transformation. It is a curious word. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who invented the concept of genocide during the Second World War, cogently observed that such transformation was an essential part of the Soviet program for expansion, for it offers the quick way of bringing unity out of the diversity of cultures and nations that constitute the Soviet Empire. Lemkin famously shared these thoughts during a 1953 commemoration in New York on the 20th anniversary of the Holodomor, in a speech on what he described, again very famously, as perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. This attempted destruction is self-evidently an ongoing process, which both predated the Soviet experiment and now postdates it. Thus, the Holodomor, as Lemkin identified, was merely an especially horrifying part of a genocidal whole, with the weapon used against the farmers being perhaps the most terrible of all, starvation. Yet, he added, there has been an attempt to dismiss this high point of Soviet cruelty. This attempted dismissal, as it played out in Western media and politics, and the central role of the Communist International and its satellite communist parties abroad in promoting such denialism to Western audiences, even as Ukrainians were still starving, rests at the heart of my own research. Indeed, it forms a constitutive part of my new monograph with Bloomsbury Press that Carolina kindly mentioned, titled Communist Propaganda in Pre-Cold War America, which is a general history, really, of the American Communist Party's official newspaper, The Daily Worker, and by extension, I would argue, a proxy for a history of the party itself. But before we discuss communist media, I'd like to begin with a story of capitalist opportunity. During the summer of 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression, a group of well-heeled American business executives gathered for an evening of fine dining at the historic Hotel Savoy in central Moscow. Representing the Great Northern Railway, they had been invited to the Soviet Union to help develop its transportation network, part of the Stalinist regime's ambitious 5-year plan to modernize the nation's industrial base. Great Northern Railway would not be the only Western corporation to participate in this highly publicized drive, with the scholar Thomas Hughes noting that, quote, the cream of American firms were eager to sell their state-of-the-art to the Reds. But it was among the earliest. One of the attendees that night was the firm's president, Ralph Budd, pictured here, as well as his unassuming secretary, Homer B. Bassett. Bassett laconically recalled in his unpublished diaries that they had a fairly good meal, and even the opportunity to meet the famed New York Times Moscow correspondent, Walter Duranty. The British-born Duranty, pictured in the center here, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1932 for his coverage of the Soviet Union, was one of the most celebrated journalists of his time, his presence at public events occasionally provoking prolonged pandemonium among adoring and often very influential fans, including President Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself. The prominent American publication The Nation would praise his Soviet reporting as enlightening and dispassionate, while the main American communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, would similarly call his dispatches highly instructive. According to the paper, he has done more than any other American journalist to promote understanding between the peoples of the US and the USSR. That understanding was grounded in a positive vision of the Stalinist regime and its policies, with Duranty optimistically suggesting in 1931 that millions of Westerners would emigrate to the communist East due to the success so far of the 5-year plan and the distress in capitalist countries. Nor was he alone in his suggestions, with the famous author George Bernard Shaw more directly telling young Americans that same year to go to Russia and settle there. And while the numbers never matched Duranty's projections or Shaw's wishes, thousands did take the gamble and suffer greatly for it in the ensuing years of chaos, violence, and terror. But in the early 1930s, it seemed to many foreign dignitaries as if the Soviet Union was a land of hope, to quote Shaw once again. The American railway employee Homer Bassett's initial impression of this communist land was actually somewhat quite positive. However, his impression soon soured in the face of what he called a terrific shortage of supplies. And by the time his party left the comforts of Moscow, his feelings had begun to change. He soon beheld with horror what he called one of the most tragic sights we have ever witnessed. Peasants, men, women, and children locked up in stinking prison cars like so many cattle. The wretched farmers overseen by eagle-eyed secret police he encountered throughout the otherwise bucolic Soviet countryside, as well as the prisoners on that train, prisoners in quotes, were the early products of a process known as collectivization, autocrat Joseph Stalin's ongoing effort to assume state control of private agriculture in order to fund his concurrent industrialization drive. As we now know, the consequences of this effort would prove devastating to his own citizens, millions of whom would perish from 1932 to 1934 in this pursuit of total economic and administrative power. Yet despite committing what many governments and international organizations today recognize not merely as an atrocity but as genocide, the Stalinist regime faced almost no external consequences at the time, political or otherwise. Actually, the US recognized the Soviet Union in the winter of 1933, and soon afterwards the League of Nations adopted a resolution inviting the communist state to join its ranks, legitimizing the Stalinist regime's brutal rule and policies before the international community. Why the West failed to act to prevent or alleviate mass starvation in Soviet Ukraine is, I would argue, at the core of studying this particular atrocity and may indeed offer contemporary lessons. It also, as Carolina mentioned, serves as the subject of my contribution to this upcoming massive open online course available through the Coursera platform and the University of Alberta on the Holodomor, which I should mention again is not only the first of its kind, but also, thanks to the generous support of donors, freely available as an undergraduate level offering. And I'd just like to briefly play the introduction to my particular module.
In this module, we'll explore to what extent the international community, particularly in Europe and North America, was aware of the Holodomor in Ukraine during the early 1930s. We'll examine efforts by the media, governments, and private organizations to cover and cover up the tragedy. And we'll demonstrate that previous assumptions that the Holodomor was a hidden famine are misleading. In fact, there was widespread awareness among powerful state and non-state actors, even those who publicly denied it was happening. Examining these narrative battles offers us a greater understanding of contemporary discussions about misinformation, propaganda, and mass atrocity.
In fact, as the narrator notes, while it is often believed that few at the time really knew about mass starvation in Ukraine, with commentators sometimes referring to it as a quote-unquote hidden famine, recent scholarship has shown that foreign journalists, governments, and even aid organizations were actually very well informed about the Holodomor as it was happening. Their lack of action grew not necessarily out of a lack of knowledge per se, but rather out of a series of political considerations that led to what the Moscow correspondent Eugene Lyons contemporaneously described as a conspiracy of silence. As the early scholar of Stalinism and the Holodomor, Robert Conquest, would corroboratively note, in the first major English language history of the tragedy, deception was practiced on a grand scale. In particular, every effort was made to persuade the West that no famine was taking place, and later that none had in fact taken place. Stalin knew that even though the truth may be readily available, the deceiver need not give up. He saw that flat denial on the one hand and the injection into the pool of information of a corpus of positive falsehood on the other were sufficient to confuse the issue. And that's the key there, to confuse the issue. Conquest's words, though referencing past events, will of course no doubt strike contemporary listeners as particularly timely and relevant given our current media landscape. While these phenomena are sometimes seen as postmodern inventions of the social media age that oft critiqued menace of fake news, the history of the Holodomor demonstrates that they actually have strong historical roots in print-based mass media, and specifically in this case in the informational and ideological battles of the early 1930s. Responding to a growing number of credible reports of famine in the Soviet Union in 1933, the New York Times' Walter Duranty notoriously penned articles like "Russians hungry but not starving," even as he told British diplomats confidentially that he thought it quite possible that as many as 10 million people may have died across the Soviet Union. By exploring this phenomenon in more detail, we can begin to understand exactly what Eugene Lyons had meant by describing the world's response to the Holodomor as a conspiracy of silence. Now, when the Great Northern Railway's Homer Bassett returned to Moscow after his revealing trip through the suffering Soviet countryside in the summer of 1930, he tried to make sense of the troubling sights he had witnessed by interrogating the city's American expats, of which there are a number. We were told that the reason for the food shortage is because the Soviet government tried to force the peasants in the collective farms, Bassett recalled after a dinner with Walter Duranty's counterpart at the Christian Science Monitor, a man named William Henry Chamberlain. Publicly, Chamberlain had been a strong supporter of the Soviets, but privately, he and his Russian-born wife, Sonia, would tell guests that this is because they have to be extremely careful what they say to anyone. So when these food shortages developed into widespread famine 2 years later, Chamberlain held his tongue, at least until he returned to the U.S. During the winter of 1932 and the spring of 1933, stark famine stalked through great areas of Ukraine and the North Caucasus, levying a 10% death toll on a population of 50 or 60 millions, he wrote in Russia's Iron Age in 1934. Yet according to the Stalinist regime, he added, quote, "The famine did not occur." The Soviet state was not alone in denying what we now call the Holodomor, though, with Chamberlain's counterpart at the Nation, Louis Fisher, and the aforementioned Walter Duranty being perhaps the most well-known examples of well-respected foreign correspondents downplaying or covering up the severity of the famine. However, in the case of journalists like Fisher, Chamberlain, and Duranty, all of whom were ostensibly unaffiliated with the Bolshevik movement and all of whom had traveled extensively in Ukraine specifically in 1932 or 1933, the motivation for their public disavowals was not necessarily strictly ideological, but also professional. As well-paid and highly respected correspondents for legacy media outlets in the US, they actually had very good reason to avoid angering the Soviet government with their reporting, as ultimately they depended on that government's good graces for residency and for access. In 1937, Chamberlain would admit that his coverage from those years suffered somewhat from the self-imposed censorship dictated by a desire to remain in the Soviet Union, while Durante himself would openly declare in his 1935 memoir that he refused to be sidetracked by moral issues. Eugene Lyons, who reported for United Press at the time, more bluntly explained that the taboos of a powerful government and an angry know-nothing mood are not broken lightly by resident newspapermen who have jobs to protect and families to feed. And the rewards could be great. As mentioned, Durante would win a Pulitzer Prize, and Louis Fisher would have a distinguished career as a reporter, novelist, and professor at Princeton University. Monetary gain came hand over fist with denial, downplaying, and deflection in the face of mass atrocity. Meanwhile, the Soviet government itself also maintained a network of advocates and operatives abroad who simultaneously worked to blind foreigners to the harsher realities of Soviet life. This network centered around an ostensibly independent, Moscow-based political organization called the Communist International, or Comintern, which by the early 1930s, to quote its most prominent English language scholars, Kevin McDermott and Jeremy Agnew, was kept in existence primarily as a propaganda weapon for the first socialist state, its dual purpose being to trumpet abroad the successes of the five-year plan and to rally the international working class to the defense of the Soviet Union. And in order to understand how such a weapon was wielded to cover up the Holodomor, we might consider the specific case of this organization's American affiliate, the Communist Party of the United States, or CPUSA, which under the Comintern's direction diligently defended the Stalinist regime's increasingly autocratic actions before an often quite admittedly skeptical US public. This defense could be bolstered. Moscow officials would instruct their communist counterparts in New York during the fall of 1931 by using party media to argue that, quote, in the richest land on earth, there's the greatest poverty among the unemployed, and to denounce the policy of the American government and the American capitalists by pointing to the example of the Soviet Union. Comintern officials were very helpful, by the way, with telling you what's important. You can see it's in caps or it's underlined. They made it very clear by pointing to the example of the Soviet Union. In the early 1930s, in fact, the CPUSA, through its media outlets, desperately sounded the alarm. Party propaganda repeatedly warned that a horrific famine had struck the nation, impacting hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. It was, their journalists accusatorily claimed, murder of the people by a government. Each day, more than 1,000 drop away, another article claimed. It is famine in the midst of plenty. Will it continue to cannibalism? The author of this piece asked rhetorically and rather morbidly. But according to these dedicated communists, Americans had a way out, the way of Soviet Russia. The Soviet counterpart always loomed large in this coverage. As the CPUSA's leader, Earl Browder, would explain at a national convention in 1934, clearly the world is divided into two systems moving in opposite directions. As I found out digging through the archives, though, these words were not his. A few weeks earlier, Browder had actually received direct and detailed instructions from the Comintern in Moscow to contrast the world of dying capitalism to the world of victorious socialism in his speech's introduction, which he dutifully did. During these troubled years, the Comintern regularly relayed such orders to their devoted comrades in New York, repeatedly telling them to damn the American government's failures and celebrate the Soviet state's successes, including its unprecedented agricultural collectivization campaign. Yet all was not necessarily well in this imagined triumphal world of victorious socialism. In the spring of 1933, sensational first-hand accounts began arriving in the English-speaking press indicating that the Soviet Union, and in particular Ukraine, had itself been struck by famine on a colossal scale. Responding quickly to the resulting public relations crisis this story engendered, Comintern officials told the CPUSA's leadership in May 1933 that it was necessary to conduct extensive and most concrete but capable propaganda of the successes of collectivization in agriculture in the USSR. Specifically, the party needed to explain to the American people that the collective farm system was necessary and superior, that collectivization took place voluntarily, and that, in a nod to the difficulties in the Soviet Union, in the USA, the collectivization of farming can be realized with less difficulty. Daily worker correspondents reporting out of Kyiv and Kharkiv would do just that, penning articles like "Ukraine collectives have best harvest in 30 years," and "Debt-free farmers of Ukraine get large excess of cash and grain," while assuring their readers that any stories of starvation were simply odious lies and slander, which a certain section of the bourgeois press, following the example of the German fascists, are spreading about the Soviet collective farming districts, particularly in the Ukraine. Curiously enough, it would be a Yiddish language publication with a decidedly socialist bent called the Jewish Daily Forward that would draw much of their ire in this regard. The Forward spits hatred at the USSR, read one typical Daily Worker headline from December 1933, in which the authors complained that the Forward was mouthing every rotten slander about famine in the Ukraine, repeating every lie that was coming out of the Vatican, popes, and bishops, out of the publicity machines of the Hitler government. As a self-retrospective prepared by the Forward in 2022 to mark the outlet's 125th anniversary explained, this coverage had become a primary source of American information on the Holodomor, especially after some of labor editor Harry Lang's material was reprinted from Yiddish into English in the New York Evening Journal, a journal owned by the conservative media mogul William Randolph Hearst in 1935. Now, Lang's now celebrated stories, would then, at the time, prove deeply and devastatingly controversial for this very reason, because he was willing to talk about what he saw when he went to Ukraine. And controversial not merely among communist apparatchiks. On April 17, 1935, the Daily Worker's front page led with an extraordinary series of pro-Soviet testimonials from a number of prominent socialists and liberals who claimed to have visited the Soviet Union, testimonials solicited by the editors in response to the New York Evening Journal's translation and republication of Lang's slanderous anti-Soviet articles, which had begun only 2 days earlier. This was a very fast response. These slanderous articles recounted a trip he had taken in mid-1933 with his wife, Lucy Robbins Lang, through famished villages outside Kyiv and the Kharkov zone of Russia, as he phrased it, where we were shaken by the scenes of famine. Fittingly, Kharkiv was also the very same city from which the Daily Worker's own foreign correspondent, Nathaniel Buchwald, would proudly proclaim that same summer that farmers of Ukraine get large excess of cash and grain. Part of a series of reports from the winter of 1932 onwards in which he would testify on the basis of personal observation in the Crimea and the Ukraine to the spirit of optimism prevailing among the peasants in the collective farms. Now, Harry Lang, having himself gone down to the Ukraine and saw with my own eyes the destruction wrought there, the wreckage of a great country, was thus directly and dangerously undermining the CPUSA's triumphalist narratives about the glories of Soviet agriculture. That these informed claims of mass starvation from an otherwise sympathetic socialist really did pose a serious threat to this Comintern-ordered party propaganda of the successes of collectivization was made especially obvious by the Daily Worker's editors so quickly turning to their most prominent non-communist readers for public support in ruining Lang's reputation and career. As this author recounted in a 2022 lecture on Holodomor denial in the American Communist Press, the curious collection of prominent contributors included the author J.W. Wise, who branded Lang a pen prostitute printing starvation slanders, the activist Margaret Lamont, who cited the reports of Louis Fisher, Walter Duranty, and other competent observers of the situation in Soviet Russia as proof that Lang's lurid story had no merit. The socialist and trade unionist Powers Hapgood, who dismissed Lang's writing as ridiculously melodramatic and suggested that his long delay publishing articles proves a financial interest. Der Tag manager and Brooklyn Daily Eagle columnist B.Z. Goldberg, who admitted that there was a famine in the Ukraine but blamed the peasants for sabotaging the collectivization program and asserted that there was now plenty of food. And most surprisingly of all, the well-respected theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who censured Lang for accepting the Hearst propaganda in regard to Russian starvation. Jointly, they had levied an accusation of journalistic indiscretion with which readers then and now would be all too familiar. Essentially, Lang was promoting fake news, and his supposed tissue of lies was made all the more despicable because it comes from a socialist writer that had the indecency to sell himself to Hearst, whose New York Evening Journal possessed a justifiably mixed record, including in its coverage of the Holodomor. On March 4th, 1935, only a few months earlier, the nation's Louis Fisher had exposed the paper for relying on misattributed and misdated photos purportedly of famine in Ukraine from a fabulist going by the name Thomas Walker. This highly publicized editorial error and the endearingly controversial figure of Hearst himself would be utilized to great effect by Soviet sympathizers to dismiss the entirety of the New York Evening Journal's extensive and varied reporting on the issue. As Lucy Robbins Lang bitterly recalled in a 1948 memoir, my husband Harry was held responsible for all the ideas that William Randolph Hearst had ever expressed. Nor, she added more disturbingly, was the campaign limited to mudslinging. For these initial attacks in the Daily Worker would be followed up by a fierce and sustained campaign of harassment that traumatized the couple. Hell broke loose, she explained, asserting that they were repeatedly subjected to vile slander and threats from American communists, and even intimidation from the OGPU, which intimated through intermediary means that their extended families still living in Russia and Ukraine would be targeted for persecution. That her assertions, at least in the former case, were not entirely unfounded can be verified through a cursory examination of the Daily Worker's issues from the last 2 weeks of April 1935 alone, which contained dozens of articles condemning Lang variously as a prostitute, a liar, a traitor, and a fascist. The editors would go beyond these insulting repudiations, however, printing angry letters from readers asserting that there is no punishment too severe for so vile a beast as the so-called socialist Harry Lang, and conspicuously featuring not-so-veiled threats from its own columnists. Warning to Mr. Harry Lang of the socialist forward and latest recruit to Hearst's staff of anti-Soviet lie makers, one contributor cried. Stay away from the picket line at the National Biscuit Company. Perhaps not without good reason, from this point onwards, his friends in the Garment Workers Union escorted him to and from the Jewish Daily Forward's offices. As evidenced by these April 17th testimonials, however, the communists were not alone in their censures of Lang. Soon, sympathetic local branches and national officials of the Socialist Party itself, its affiliated labor unions, and its media outlets were calling for the expulsion of Harry Lang from the Socialist Party. Its national secretary, Clarence Sr., declared that Lang has placed himself beneath contempt and repudiated his slander of Soviet Russia, deliberate efforts to bring both fascism and war to the United States. And though these condemnations were often solicited by, literally they would go to the office and knock on the door and ask you to condemn the guy, solicited by and invariably printed in the Daily Worker, a communist newspaper, their rapidity in arriving, their vitriolic content, and their sheer number, we're talking hundreds of these, throughout 1935, indicated that these feelings were real, strong, and widespread. The CPUSA had deftly portrayed the republication of Lang's Holodomor whistleblowing in the New York Evening Journal as an alliance with Hearst against the Soviet Union, in order to convince the predominantly pro-Soviet elements within the Socialist Party to join with the communists. an effort in which they were clearly somewhat successful. For while it is true that the long-hoped-for merger of the two largest Marxist parties in the U.S. never actually materialized, many within them had undoubtedly found common ground in the shared desire to guard against the capitalist attacks on the Soviet Union, as the Socialist Party's national secretary aptly put it. Thus, by May 13th, even its embattled leader, Norman Thomas, was willing to go on the record in favor of expelling Harry Lang from the Socialist Party and reprimanding the Daily Forward. Additionally, aided by eminent public personalities like the aforementioned Union Theological Seminary professor and the supreme American theologian of the 20th century, as New York Times labeled him, Reinhold Niebuhr, who called Lang's actions despicable, American Newspaper Guild president and noted columnist Hayward Brune, who told reporters that in every phrase and line they, i.e. the Lang articles, carry the smell of being phony, and Louis Fisher's fellow contributor at The Nation and one of the most prominent American journalists to focus on labor, Benjamin Stolberg, who accused Lang of telling lies about the Soviet Union and the Hearst press. Collectively, the CPUSA seems to have been able to convince many well-wishers on the left not merely that reports of a Ukrainian famine were an exaggeration, as the New York Times' Walter Duranty would infamously insist, but that, to quote the Daily Worker's popular columnist Michael Gold, they were nothing more than the Hearsts and the Chamberlains repeating their Nazi-inspired lies. And it was out of this collective damnation of Harry Lang, this common cause for the defense of the land of socialism, the Soviet Union, that a united front has been forged, the paper's editors proudly declared. Thus, the origins of that fondly remembered Depression-era coming together of progressive forces, not only in America but across the world, which we now refer to as the Popular Front, may at least partially lie in a long-obscured collaboration to deny the Holodomor in service of the Stalinist regime, or rather in defense of the land of socialism. In the case of the CPUSA itself, at least, this service was, of course, rendered upon the orders of that regime itself, with a long-standing mandate from Moscow to popularize the USSR, particularly from the angle of creating strong weapons against the enemies of the USSR and socialism, and to utilize the example of victorious socialist construction in the Soviet Union as against the capitalist countries, and with those specific aforementioned orders to conduct extensive and concrete but capable propaganda of the successes of collectivization, the American Party and its press outlets have been obliged, regardless of domestic political cost or benefit, to campaign against those claiming that a devastating and deadly famine had struck Ukraine. And it very much was a campaign, by the way, as the party's own records indicate. Central Committee circulars addressed to all districts from the first half of 1935 contained direct and unmistakable references to the, quote, campaign against Hearst and his lies about 6 million starving in the Soviet Union. As this author has previously noted, meaning me, such campaigns would be a regular occurrence whenever the Stalinist regime faced any serious public relations crisis, with a litany not just of communists, but also of prominent Americans, parentheses non-communists, as the Comintern itself called them, stepping forward to publicly and profusely justify, explain away, or deny forced labor and relocation, mass persecution and murder, and even what many people would now call today a genocide. In fact, these campaigns were occasionally quite orchestrated and inorganic, and I just want to give one quick example of that. Following the Nazi-Soviet pact in the fall of 1939, the CPUSA, its subsidiaries, and its supporters suddenly became foreign policy isolationists in the face of fascist aggression against Poland. In response to orders from Moscow that, quote, the issue of fascism is secondary, and that the position of democracies was now more hostile than that of fascist states, the American Party told the Comintern that they had carried on a vigorous campaign against all defamers in explanation and defense of the pact. And this so-called vigorous campaign would also come to include non-communists. In one particularly fascinating internal memo dated to December 1940, the CPUSA's Moscow representative, a man named Nat Ross, wrote his superior in the Comintern, a Russian philosopher and Soviet apparatchik, Mikhail Yovchuk, about prominent Americans, non-communists, who would write effective brochures explaining and defending the peace policy of the Soviet Union and answering the arguments of the enemy. That Ross was not writing to Yovchuk unprompted can be inferred by the inclusion of "with regard to," and the resultant printed propaganda to be prepared by these supposedly unaffiliated fellow travelers, explicitly for wide mass consumption and mass influence, that's the words that they used, was surely intended to complement the American Party's own previously discussed vigorous campaign against all defamers of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in its official press outlets, by leveraging the movement's social connections to reach a more mainstream audience, kind of otherwise outside of its media sway. Ross himself repeatedly hinted at the Comintern's assumed motives throughout the text, emphasizing in his descriptions of the persons he included that they would reach and influence wide circles, could reach a broad audience beyond the left-wing circles, or had a considerable mass reputation. And those he proposed as standouts, his words, for the task could very reasonably have been described as prominent Americans of the era. These included the outstanding American practitioner of literary naturalism, Theodore Dreiser, one of the most notable radicals in the history of the United States, a woman named Anna Louise Strong, and the socialist author, teacher, and humanist philosopher, as well as co-founder of the ACLU, a man named Corliss Lamont. Alongside the others listed, they constituted a veritable who's who of the fellow traveling set. These were not destitute radicals, but respected and wealthy members of what Ross himself labeled the intelligentsia, including the son, and I'm not kidding here, including the son of a partner at J.P. Morgan and an heir to the Vanderbilt fortune. Very, very wealthy old money folks. The first foreign scholars to examine this document after the collapse of the Soviet Union, John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clare, noted that each of those named in the document either had or would directly produce pro-communist isolationist propaganda, or had or would found CPUSA-controlled isolationist fronts, like the American Peace Mobilization, that produced such propaganda. And actually, I would argue that to this checkered public legacy, the revelations of the Soviet archives offer very little aside from affirmation. For one did not and does not necessarily need to read in the stark black and white typeface of an internal Comintern memorandum that an unswervingly pro-Soviet socialist like Strong would write only what is okayed by the CPUSA, or see her referred to as Comrade Strong in the same archival collection, which also incidentally revealed that her contributions to outlets like the magazine New Masses were written with the assistance of the press department of the CPUSA. One does not need to see all this in these secret, now released documents to know that she was a reliable propagandist for the Bolshevik cause. That much could already be, and possibly should already have been, inferred by her own statements at the time in party media like the Daily Worker. In fact, even statements going back a decade, almost. Take this one. The greatest agricultural revolution in history, she would proudly tell the paper in the winter of 1933, could not possibly have been accomplished without sacrifices on the part of those who carried out this tremendous change, and suffering, especially on the part of those who opposed it. And suffer they undoubtedly did. Appalled as I was by the excruciating sights of the famine, Harry Lang had foresightedly ruminated regarding his own reporting on the Holodomor, I was even more appalled by the task of conveying the truth, conveying a picture of the monster which created the famine. Yet despite his apprehensions, and in the face of threats to his career, his cause, and his life, he conveyed what he had seen to an audience that would grow to hate him for it, to an audience that did not even have the patience to read his work before they flung his name into the dirt. I have not read the articles, Reinhold Niebuhr nonchalantly admitted in his rebuke of the despicable Lang. I don't read the Hearst Press. One cannot debate with him, another contributor to the casting down added in a similar vein. And it would have been irresponsible to do so. After all, the leading American experts on Soviet affairs had persuasively demonstrated that collectivization was an astounding success, and they possessed all the official media and state stamp of approval to back their claims up. Now, you may be asking what particular contemporary conclusions may be drawn from this potentially pertinent parable of past famine. Well, we might begin by considering the scholar Stanley Cohen's cogent observation about atrocity denial more generally. He noted that the enigmas of denial and bad faith are encoded within the language we use to converse with ourselves about suffering and atrocities. The public texts of perpetrators and their apologists hardly need much decoding. Listen to a spokesperson, political leader, or bureaucrat come out with the usual patent lies, desperate evasions, subtle half-truths, pathetic reassurances, convenient fictions, absurd analogies. Where are all these people in that cognitive space between knowing and not knowing that they are lying? Perhaps they have already entered a postmodern version of the Oedipal state, knowing and not knowing at the same time, but also not caring. Which is to say, what has become clear to me in the course of studying the Holodomor and its initial reception abroad is that, interestingly enough, knowledge or the lack thereof was never really the primary issue standing in the way of acknowledgement. Actually, as I'm exploring in my current research project on the American government, to pick one of many state actors for whom the same could be said, American officials actually had intimate knowledge at the highest levels of food shortages in Ukraine from almost the moment they emerged. You're talking like 1930, 1931, and from a wide variety of sources, including, incidentally enough, the New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty. In this candid conversation with the staffer at the Paris embassy, which was promptly forwarded to the Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Duranty spoke of the growing seriousness of the food shortage. This is December 1932, by the way, which he ascribed to difficulties which the government was having with its scheme of collective farming, noting that the production of foodstuffs had greatly decreased. He talked authoritatively of concurrent 20 and 30% declines year over year in agricultural production. And he frankly stated, again, this is December 1932, that he did not know what the next few months would produce if the Soviet government did not decide to import foodstuffs. Rather than deny the impending disaster, which over the next 6 months would claim nearly 4 million lives in Ukraine alone, Duranty, who, as we've seen, would go on in public to downplay the tragedy, to which he freely admitted in private to government officials in both the US and the UK, Duranty instead kind of deflects blame onto the so-called kulaks. Indeed, it is impossible to discuss denial or downplay or deflection of atrocity without reference to a fourth D, dehumanization. And without the sober understanding that the not caring of which Cohen writes, and which Duranty displays here, is often enabled by carefully concerted campaigns of deliberate dehumanization. During the mid-1920s, under the conciliatory New Economic Policy and indigenization schemes, the Bolsheviks had proven somewhat willing to maintain this kind of uneasy truce with their non-Russian rural subjects. The subsequent collectivization campaign deliberately broke that truce, and Stalin's strategy to deal with the inevitable resistance in the countryside was to, like all empires, divide and conquer. Rather than declare war on the entire peasantry, he declared war on a group he termed the kulaks, a very loosely and fungibly defined designation for the wealthiest strata of the peasant class in the countryside. We have developed an offensive along the whole front against the capitalist elements in the countryside. We have passed from a policy of restricting the exploiting tendency of the kulaks to the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class, he proclaimed in 1929. This policy of class elimination by way of kind of arbitrary categorization resulted, as we've already discussed, in death and dislocation in the millions. And naturally, American communist media enthusiastically participated in this degradation and defamation of the kulak and cheered on the repressive campaign that accompanied it in the Soviet countryside, even as they righteously and often quite reasonably condemned biased and bigoted authorities in the US. Nor did this apparent contradiction concern them in any way. When the New York Times literary reviewer John Chamberlain mildly suggested in an otherwise groveling letter to the Daily Worker's editors that the case of communists justifying imprisonment in Russia and condemning it in the US does smack of disingenuousness, One of the outlet's star columnists, the previously mentioned Michael Gold, had a ready retort. How can anyone, having even a smattering of Marx and knowing the class forces at work today, naively ask the communists if they are not being hypocritical in fighting for the Scottsboro Boys and Tom Mooney, while there are also thousands of prisoners in the Soviet Union? There's a war on, John, he explained, answering his own rhetorical and loaded question. Clearly then, Gold and his journalistic compatriots in the US viewed themselves as active and essential participants in Stalin's very one-sided class war. As a consequence, in dozens of reprinted Soviet treatises, speeches, and declarations, the pages of the Daily Worker would give conspicuous voice to a particularly sinister phrase, liquidation of the kulaks, by which the Bolsheviks meant their elimination as a class through any and all means, really, up to and including execution. More troublingly, its own contributors readily adopted and utilized the phrase themselves in article after article after article after article. These examples, spread out over half a decade, transcend the otherwise extreme shifts in the party line during this time. The kulaks, now liquidated, the CPUSA's leader Earl Browder could state matter-of-factly in 1938, having referred with glowing pride to the party's historically imperative policy of decisively defeating the kulak resistance to the building of socialism. That the all-powerful Soviet state had managed to brutalize the peasantry into submission seems to have filled Browder and his ilk with vindictive satisfaction. Much like during the Great Terror a few years later, or actually in that year of 1938, when, in Earl Browder's own words, regime enemies became cholera germs to justify mass murder, the language used to depict the kulak was, in addition to being openly eliminationist, often openly dehumanizing, with the Bolsheviks showing a pronounced preference for the descriptor parasite. The parasite kulak always cunningly utilized hunger in their exploitation. A 1935 Pravda special to the Daily Worker mendaciously suggested in what must be called an act of massive projection on behalf of a state that was at that very moment, and as a matter of kind of continuing policy, consciously and deliberately restricting access to food as a means to compel its population to work themselves, sometimes quite literally to the bone. While the revolution freed the peasantry from the yoke of the landlord, the paper's Moscow correspondent Nathaniel Buchwald had mused in the midst of mass starvation a year earlier, it did not completely free the peasant from the rule of the village parasite and exploiter, the kulak, whose continued existence made agricultural collectivization and the harsh policies that accompanied it all the more necessary. Incidentally, the title of that piece was A Government That Actually Helps Farmers. There were a number of articles in this April 1933 edition about starvation in the US, which is what this is a reference to. Meanwhile, the CPUSA official Max Bedacht would note that the workers' democracy of the Soviet Union disenfranchises the capitalists on the ground that they are useless parasites, and complained that when the workers' government of Russia executes a kulak because of murderous counter-revolutionary activities, then outraged civilization is defended vociferously by the Washington government. Not that vociferously, though. In fact, when it came to mass starvation in 1932 and 1933, the presidential references are deliberately muted. I think you could say, I shall say this entirely off the record, Russia is today probably, so far as we know, not in a position to do very much wheat exporting. They need their own wheat, Roosevelt delicately explained to reporters on March 15th, 1933. The ever-obliging Washington Press Corps kept their word, and from what I can tell in the records of these press transcripts, never bothered him about it again. Roosevelt's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, had made a number of similarly oblique remarks in 1932, though publicly, admittedly. They have ignored the effect of Russia's dumping into the world the commodities taken from its necessitous people. It's a hard word to say. Necessitous people in a desperate attempt to secure money with which to carry on, shall I call it, a New Deal. He complained at the Democrats for ignoring Soviet wheat exports in the face of famine. 2 decades later, in his own memoirs, he would likewise complain of the Roosevelt administration's late 1933 recognition of the Soviet Union on the grounds that at the time of recognition, it was known to the entire world that more than 5 million people had been cruelly butchered in Russia. It was known to the entire world. And regardless of your thoughts on Hoover's often quite bitter reminiscences, more generally, I do think it's worth dwelling on this statement of his. It was known to the entire world. And in doing so, let us add to denial, downplaying, deflection, and dehumanization a fifth D, dismissal. In the fall of 1933, the U.S. Postmaster General received a letter from an American World War I veteran of Ukrainian descent, quote, sending you some advertising matter together with photographs which were presented to this organization by 2 American citizens who are visiting Ukraine. The compilation contained photos of starving peasants, mostly women and children. Ukrainian peasants are purposely condemned to die of hunger for their activities and aspirations for independence, one description included read. But rather than respond, the postmaster forwarded this letter to the Democratic Party's New York office, quote, because there might be dynamite in it. Will you handle it? He asked. And the Democratic Party office in New York would not handle it, as it turned out. Instead, the letter was then forwarded to the Secretary of State Cordell Hull himself on similar grounds. I am quite certain that your department will agree that it is a very ticklish situation to handle. And how did Secretary Hull handle this ticklish situation and diffuse this dynamite? Well, his head of East European Affairs, Robert Kelly, would write back that the material was read with interest. Not with enough interest, however, to comment publicly or provide assistance. Unfortunately, there do not appear to be any measures which this government may appropriately take at this time in order to alleviate the sufferings of these unhappy people. Secretary Hull would explain in one typical spring 1933 letter addressing a request for assistance forwarded by Kansas Senator Arthur Capper, a Republican. Concerns about mass starvation and these sort of internal private communications with private citizens, the concerns weren't denied per se. You'll note that neither Kelly nor Hull tried to argue with their interlocutors or reject their claims. Instead, their concerns were simply dismissed, and when discussion began for U.S. recognition of the Soviet Union later that year, the millions of dead Soviet citizens, at least as far as historians could tell, played no role in the cordial considerations. In fact, it seems that whatever concerns there were over these manifold victims had to do more with the degree to which this so-called ticklish situation might, quote-unquote, dynamite ongoing diplomatic negotiations. Hence the private, yet polite dismissals, the off-the-record admissions to journalists, and the public silence on the Holodomor as it unfolded. One recalls yet again that old Buddhist saying, Mizaru, Kikazaru, Iwazaru. Actually, in preparing the material for this lecture, 2 more ancient and yet timeless maxims came to my mind. The first from King Solomon, there is no new thing under the sun. And the second from my king, Jesus Christ, therefore speak I to them in parables, because they seeing do not see, and hearing they hear not, neither understand. With these in mind, and considering the exemplary ephemera presented to you today, I would finally like to turn and address the question and title of this talk, How to Hide a Famine, or Holodomor's History and Heuristic, a method to solve problems. Because what the Holodomor presents is a method for mass murder in the mass media age. Stalin faced a problem, which was a people. The main issue now is Ukraine, he wrote in August 1932. Matters are extremely bad. By this, he did not mean, of course, the starvation of which his own hand-picked henchmen in the Ukrainian Communist Party were warning of. Rather, he meant the warnings themselves. If we do not correct the situation in Ukraine immediately, he countered, we could lose Ukraine. And so he sent the order. Set yourself the goal of turning Ukraine into a fortress of the USSR, a real model republic within the shortest possible time. The problem was a people, and the solution was their slaughter to ensure subsequent submission. a cull of 20 to 30% of the population through relocation and resettlement, a cull through imprisonment and execution, a cull through forced starvation. But in this case, the methods could not be purely physical, because the world's only communist state relied on the world for both political legitimacy through internationalist ties with foreign peoples and international recognition from foreign governments, and for economic engagement through the import of expertise and industry and the export of grain for the hard currency with which such expertise and industry could be imported at scale. This is what sustained the Stalinist regime's ambitious 5-year plan to remake itself and remold its people into new Soviet men. And it succeeded by that regime's own estimations. The policy of eliminating the kulaks and of complete collectivization has triumphed. Stalin boasted at the appropriately named 1934 Congress of Victors. What arguments can be advanced against this fact? And rather than argue with the man, let us instead consider the constituent parts of the plan that led to this apparently astounding triumph. The method, or heuristic, if you will. I think the method actually involves the cultivation of two distinct but symbiotic ecosystems, what I'll call an ecosystem of destruction and an ecosystem of denial. Ecosystems of destruction are what you might typically think of when you think of genocide in its original definition as coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944. That is, broadly speaking, a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. In the context of the Holodomor, this ecosystem featured the widespread theft and destruction of agricultural goods and property to the point of mass starvation, the dismantling of effective food distribution and production systems in the famine-affected areas of Ukraine, the sealing of borders around and within the famine zones of Ukraine, and prevention of escape by arrest and shooting, the collective punishment through blacklisting of whole communities justified by constructs such as quotas and dehumanizing ideas like kulak, the collective punishment through blacklisting of the mass arrest, torture, and execution of purported nationalists, terrorists, and saboteurs on supposed national security grounds, the militarized occupation of rural Ukraine in response to widespread unrest, again on supposed national security grounds, the destruction of religious and cultural sites like the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, and the concurrent liquidation of related entities and individuals, the purging of national authorities and cultural institutions in Ukraine, and the resettlement and settlement of Russians in depopulated regions of Ukraine, especially the Donbass. By contrast, the ecosystem of denial encompassed the topics of my talk today. Broadly, this ecosystem featured the denial of famine, or even famine-like conditions in domestic Soviet state media, and by representatives of the state. The leveraging of affiliated and sympathetic foreign interest groups, lobbies, and individuals to engage in famine denial abroad, including by smearing and slandering critics and whistleblowers, the denial of media access and aid entry from interested foreign entities like the International Red Cross on the grounds that no help was needed, there was no crisis, they claimed, the Stalinist regime's denial of Ukrainian self-determination and assumption of Ukraine as an integral part of the Soviet empire and territory, the Western legacy media's embrace of the occupying imperial powers' narratives and logics by downplaying the mass starvation and deflecting the blame to the victims themselves, the linguistic dehumanization of the regime's enemies as vermin, bugs, and germs, and the concurrent nullification of Ukrainian personhood as a matter of Soviet state policy. And lastly, the legitimization of the Stalinist regime by Western governments through the dismissal of protests and petitions and the proffering of diplomatic support and economic cooperation. I would argue that these two systems are not only inherently self-reinforcing, but also internally self-reinforcing. And what do I mean by that? I'll just give you one example. The Daily Worker's early hostility to Walter Duranty's intermittently mild reporting on Soviet conditions, with them repeatedly describing Duranty's reporting as subtle poison, actually strengthened his centrist credentials as an impartial and dispassionate reporter, as he was regarded at the time. And his equivocations about an exaggerated famine could then, 2 years later, be quoted directly by the communist outlet to bolster their own negationist account of the tragedy. Do you see how it works? The Soviets, through the Comintern, fed funding, articles, and orders to communist propagandists abroad at outlets like the Daily Worker to praise collectivization and deny any and all starvation. Denials which were in turn absorbed uncritically by sympathetic fellow travelers like Reinhold Niebuhr, who themselves took sponsored trips to the Soviet Union, which they then used to publicly reject Harry Lang's reports in 1935. The denial of media access to Ukraine and the leveraging of press access in Moscow encouraged uncritical reporting of collectivization and what foreign correspondent Eugene Lyons called a conspiracy of silence among reporters, whose deferential coverage and victim blaming legitimated before Western audiences the Stalinist regime's policies in Ukraine and rejection of aid. These oppressive policies, premised on the programmatic rejection of Ukrainian statehood, enabled the labeling of any and all dissent as illegitimate nationalist terrorism. In turn, the dehumanization of the kulak drove an increasingly brutal interpretation of these policies on the ground. Collectively, this effort to, quote, confuse the issue through sympathetic or state media, as Robert Conquest put it, allowed for famine to become politicized, to quote the scholar James Mace, and ultimately enabled Western governments and corporations more interested in making money than protecting human lives to ignore the Holodomor as it happened. And the legitimization of the Stalinist state through diplomatic recognition and trade ties, even in the midst of forced famine, allowed the dictator to accomplish his genocidal self-proclaimed triumph without external consequence. Much the opposite, actually. There cannot be any doubt that American recognition is of very great significance for the whole system of international relations, Stalin quipped at the Victors' Congress in 1934. That anti-Soviet bulwark has been voluntarily removed, he marveled. And once again, we must credit the man for his perspicacity, for the choice the Americans and the League of Nations made to essentially reward mass murder was just that, a choice. Much like Stalin's decision to forcibly starve the Ukrainian people into subjugation was a choice. Much like the media's misrepresentation of that starvation was a choice. These choices were made independently, to be sure, for the most part, but they were also interconnected. Moreover, to borrow from the historian Ellen Schrecker's perceptive analysis of the Cold War anti-communist movement, the interconnections are crucial. Each of its components reinforced the others, even when, as was sometimes the case, it looked as if they were operating independently. However, to return to this kind of question of contemporary conclusions that you might take from this lecture, I must, out of sensitivity and tact, defer to the interested listener to draw their own. For Dr. Schrecker has also cogently remarked that our current moment is, quote, worse than McCarthyism, and perhaps in this case it may be wise to listen to perhaps the world's foremost historical expert on the matter. Yet I do feel obliged to draw my own more general conclusions, and in doing so I would like to recall that in his own highly enlightening talk before this body last year, my predecessor, the scholar Alex de Waal, noted that the history of famine denialism is as old as the history of famine itself. And I think it's worth expanding on that a little bit, because in the context of the modern world, which since the middle of the 19th century has possessed the means and the methods to save the starving and feed the famished, the question of how to cause a famine is how to hide one. The question of how to cause a famine is precisely how to hide one. The same parallel questions, incidentally enough, might be asked of genocide. This is all to say, famine and denialism are one and the same. Genocide and denialism are one in the same. Famine is denial. Genocide is denial, physical and metaphysical denial. Denial not merely of life's foundation, but also denial of their absence. Denial of assistance, denial of escape, denial of humanity, denial of witnessing, denial of victimhood, denial of justice. The mass and prolonged torture and extermination of women and men, of young and old, by denial. The problem is power, not knowledge. The problem is that the denial was loaded from the start. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and against the worldly governors, the princes of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness which are in high places. As a matter of fact, when I look around the world today, I must admit, when I look around the world today at places as distant, with peoples as beleaguered, and with suffering as unrelenting as Ukraine as Sudan, as Palestine, I can't help but think of the Holodomor, of our own ancestors' failures and of our failures, of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptinsky's despairing 1933 appeal, powerless to provide our dying brethren with any material assistance, we call upon our faithful to beseech aid from heaven at a time when there is no hope of human assistance. And before the whole world, we again protest against the persecution of the little ones. And like the great Metropolitan, I too will end by calling on our merciful God and Savior, Jesus Christ. Our hope is in God. Thank you.
Henry, thank you very much for this very insightful, very rich, and very thought-provoking lecture. We still have some time for questions from the audience, like 5 or so minutes. I just wanted to say before we start that we have almost 70 people online, which I think is the best proof of like how important these annual meetings are for advancing the field of Holodomor studies, advancing the field of Ukrainian studies, and famine studies in general. So let's start with the questions, maybe from the audience here in person. Oh, please raise your hand, please introduce yourself, and we have a mic that is circling around the room.
That was an impressive presentation. I really like your fluidity and just on technical means that you read out that which was highlighted. Admittedly, those are old documents. So you made it accessible. Part of your knowledge claim that you're saying is so important. So I say well done. Also like your fluid style, and boy, it was an assault of information and knowledge. So I'm a bit overwhelmed. One of the things you articulate is this role of knowledge. So we're hearing this succinct thing, and I think I'm not that knowledgeable, I'm not a scholar, that there's some debate about how much was it genocide. I think that's still ongoing. It seems to me you're indicating that it was fairly clear, or at least strong evidence that this was going on. Part of that knowledge is that we can use knowledge to do things. So how do you think we can apply the insights of Holodomor to go against various things that are going on currently in the world, never mind the future? Well, how do we harvest that and make it real?
It's very simple. You just believe the victims. The way mass atrocity happens is because people don't believe the victims. 100 years later, we go back and we say, here's what the victims said. Just listen to them as it's happening. That's it.
Thank you very much. Yes, Professor Andrzejewski.
Harry Lang wasn't the only person who wrote about the famine for the Farvarts. Mendel Oshevich also he traveled to Ukraine and he wrote about it. And I'm wondering, you know, beyond sort of the party line, we know that, for example, Torgson was actively advertising in Jewish newspapers for people to buy food, for people, relatives in the United States, to buy all sorts of things for their relatives in the Soviet Union. And there must be a correspondence from people in Ukraine who are starving, who are writing to their Jewish relatives. So I'm wondering if you can kind of fill out this picture a little bit more of what's going on within the Socialist Party. I mean, there's the party line, but to what degree does this have traction? And I think you've made a pretty clear case that it does. But there must have been some element of dissent there as well, and especially because there were other people who wrote about famine in Ukraine.
Absolutely, and I will admit I cut like 5,000 words. Sorry for running long, but Also, Fred Beal, an American who his stuff was in the Ford. I'll just be honest, I'm not an expert on that. My hope with this and with kind of all these initiatives is just that like more people will look into this stuff. You know, that's what I realized writing this history of the daily worker. It's like, I shouldn't be the one to do this. Somebody should have done this 40 years ago. And I feel like that's also true with the Holodomor. This is a total aside, Olga, I'm sorry, but I saw the study of the Holodomor referred to in one text as a Holodomor industry. And I have to wonder, man, it's a really small industry. Like we need to ramp it up, right? So that's what I would say is like, I don't know the answer to that question. And I hope someone writes a PhD on it, writes a dissertation on it, one-ups anything that I study here, and just spreads more knowledge about this, not only horrific, but I would argue an event that when you center it in 20th century history, as I do in my course on the Holodomor, you learn a lot about world history, not just the Holodomor, because it is this heuristic, this model you see, and because it was so extreme, so intense, you literally had people going house to house with hooks, taking food out. In that extremity, you begin to see these broader patterns. So that's a total non-answer, Olga, I'm sorry.
I saw that we have more questions. Yes, Professor Sisson.
A few of the comments dealt with these are fascist and Nazi allegations. And I wonder how deeply that was then projected by Comintern as they're sending it out, and how important you would label that. We know from a number of the European governments, a number of others who knew about what was going on, but still believed that because the Nazis were the major problem, they shouldn't go too deeply into it. So how much does that come from the Comintern, or how much is that engendered by the Western political figures and statesmen?
What's the question I ran into, like when I'm looking at Reinhold Niebuhr's response to Lang's articles, he's calling it Hearst propaganda, but Lang published this, and Niebuhr must have known this 2 years earlier, in this obscure Yiddish language newspaper. I mean, not as obscure as the Daily Worker. It actually had about 120,000 people reading it, so it's large for that sort of daily. But then they treat it as, by virtue of being connected to Hearst, it's propaganda, ergo, I can disregard it. But when you think about it for even 2 seconds, like when you step out of the kind of immediate environment, you see how absurd that is. I mean, there's no reason to believe Harry Lang was a fascist. I don't know. I mean, I think it would be very hard for Harry Lang to have been a fascist. I think it's, in this case, simply a label that was used to delegitimize criticism. And you do see it in the Comintern files where they talk about kind of fascist streams in American media. You know, they're very interested in these media narrative battles, and like they're measuring the circulation of different presses, and they're very intensely aware of the importance of winning these media battles, is how I would put it.
Thank you. Yes, we have another question in the first row.
Sorry, just that you partly answered it. I was wondering if you could give the circulation numbers for the newspapers that you studied, roughly.
That's a good question. A matter of some controversy. They would claim at one point 100,000. The Daily Worker, more like 50,000 at its peak, which doesn't seem like a lot, but then you compare it to a magazine like The Nation, and it's doubling that magazine. So for certain places in the US at the time, like New York, you see the Daily Worker everywhere on every newsstand. And if you're a member of the party, you're reading it. And if you're a member of the quote-unquote intelligentsia and an heir to the J.P. Morgan fortune, then maybe you're also reading it. So I would argue that despite its low circulation, you're talking tens of thousands up to 50,000, it was still influential in an outsized way. And that the testimonials from all these famous people from the time tell you this. Like, they're reading the Daily Worker, and within 2 days, they're outraged. They're sending in letters, right? So that would be my answer. But yeah, you're right. I should have mentioned the circulation numbers.
We have more questions from the audience.
What you had to say was overwhelming, and I'm thinking back to that first quotation by Hannah Arendt, and how, you know, ultimately we end up with confusion, and that's where we are today. And so I'm curious to know, with your teaching, with your students, how, first of all, how are they taking in this information? And can they, or do they see what you're talking about as utterly relevant to the world that we live in today in terms of fake news, misinformation?
I mean, one of the remarkable things, and really kind of this real privilege of teaching a course called Famine and Genocide in the 20th Century, is that the people who take that course, like, they're not just taking it randomly. They're not like, oh, I got to check a box. You're taking it because you have some reason, and often I've found it's familial. And this is not just Ukraine. I do have students from Ukraine, Ukrainian Canadians, people from Sri Lanka, people from China, people from India, people from all sorts of disciplines, healthcare, medicine, who do view this topic as relevant. And I think that when they take the course, what I hope they come away with is that you can learn from the past. And you can at least witness us not learning from the past, if nothing else. So that's what I would say. The answer is yes. Like, it's not only like personally relevant, but they also see the contemporary relevance of studying kind of misinformation in the face of mass atrocity.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your detailed presentation. I agree with the previous comments that that's a lot of information we had coming at us, and I look forward to looking at it again in more detail. Given that model that you showed us, I think is very interesting, and I wonder if you could just comment on what are your thoughts about what's going on in Ukraine today? Is it a genocide? Using your model, the one that you showed us, can we draw parallelisms to what's going on in Ukraine today? Genocide, denialism,
And that's the thing, is I return to that 1944 quote from Lemkin where he talks about the destruction of the essential foundations of life with the purposes of annihilating the group. And I'm not like a contemporary expert, but when you look at the occupied parts of Ukraine today, do you see Ukrainian life thriving? Right? You see this absence of Ukrainian life imposed from above. And sometimes that absence is strictly physical, like people are literally getting driven out and replaced. And in other cases, it's a matter of sort of legal imposition of cultural norms, military imposition of cultural and linguistic norms. So yeah, that's my kind of way of looking at it. There's the sort of this old saying, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck. Yeah, I would hesitate to predict anything about the future. The world today is so uncertain, but yeah, when you're smashing up Holodomor memorials and putting up busts to Stalin, I don't think you're too interested in maintaining Ukrainian lifeways, let's put it that way.
And I think that we have the last question in the back of the audience.
Thanks again for an extraordinary presentation. This is probably a really broad question for the amount of time that we have, but so like with thoughts towards Ukraine, who is in your opinion, the Walter Duranty of today?
I'll leave you
outside of administration figures.
I'll leave you with this without getting into too much trouble. What I tell the students, we talk a lot about the New York Times. The reason I talk about the New York Times is because the Great Lady, as they call it, is we would say the paper of record. Same reason I deal with the Daily Worker. It's like, it's the official paper, so therefore, what I always tell the students about the New York Times is, maybe you heard this from your grandma, if you have nothing nice to say nothing at all. So I'll leave you with that.
I think somehow it's a very good way to end the conversation. From my side, I would like to thank Henry once again for a very insightful lecture. And once again, I would like to invite everyone to see the Holodomor commemorative exhibition at the St. Volodymyr Institute, to see the online course on the Holodomor once it is published, and this is going to happen soon, and then buy the book once it's out, and this is the end of November.
You want to spend $120? Go ahead, be my guest.
And now I would
Yes.
ask Professor Sisson for some final remarks, and then we can engage more in some kind of informal conversation with Henry.
First, just a few comments. When we began this lecture 28 years ago, we knew that we should invite James Mace. But if we had looked around, there were not large numbers of other people we would have had on a list. There were a few people working on the Holodomor. And what I think we can see in the time that has gone on, those pioneers, and then the ability to expand the field that has come largely through the generosity of our donors that has made HREC a possibility, has also made it possible for us to broaden the field, but above all, to rejuvenate it. And we have had that example today from both our introducer and our lecturer. That is, it's been wonderful to see them and their career and their knowledge growing and expanding and how much they could give back to us on that. And so I think we're all privileged by that experience. I'd also like to point out that there are two upcoming lectures that I think would be of interest to many of you. On the 25th of November at 6:30 p.m., there will be a lecture on who was Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, whom you have seen portrayed here. For those of you who might not know, is the wrong question. And it'll be given by Dr. Danilo Fedorovich. It will be at the University of St. Michael's College, and there are flyers on the table where you came in if you'd like to pick up and have information on it. And then as far as our CIUS events, we have the annual Volodymyr Delinsky Memorial Lecture. That lecture will be given this year by Professor Lucan Ahmad Way, Distinguished Professor of Democracy in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Toronto. His lecture will be on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the breakup of the liberal world order. Remind you, that is the 27th of November, 6 to 8, and please go on our CIUS or the Monk site to register for that lecture. So we invite you to those lectures. And of course, we invite you back next year for the 29th annual famine lecture. And now we'd like to give you a chance to speak with our speakers and those of us involved with the programs at the reception that awaits us. Thank you very much.